Over the years, I've learned I can safely support 2 hobbies at a time. And like most folks, my interest in hobbies kind of ebbs and flows as time goes on. So this means, as a terminal DIYer with a touch of ADHD, that I'm kind of notorious for getting projects started and maybe even to the 99-yard line before my interest gets turned on to something else. And this isn't really a big deal for anybody other than my wife when I'm doing home improvement projects. She's even bestowed the loving name of Mr. 99% on me, which I love. So I'm telling you all this because I'm working on a chair project here that I started way back in May of 2024 and for whatever reason stopped. Lately, my content has been focused heavily on getting my shitbox Fords back on the road, but on this cold day in January, I decided to wander back into the wood shop and start on this project again. Fortunately for you, maybe unfortunately for me, I did actually film a bunch of stuff when I started this however long ago, so now I get to wade into the video files and see if I can make heads and tails of all that stuff and show you how I got to this point here. Let's go. Well, folks, we have traveled back in time to May of 2024, and you will see me here tracing over my chair design with permanent marker after I've settled on what I feel like is the right design. Future past me, or past future me, whichever, is about to figure out we've made some terrible design choices. But I digress. I cut out my chair design on the whiteboard, cut it into small pieces, and will end up tracing it onto some poplar so that I can make the actual templates themselves as you see here. And then it's back to the bandsaw to cut these parts out as well. I use these thicker pieces as opposed to the thin whiteboard pieces because there's a lot more material for the bearing on the flush trim bit to ride on. You'll see what I mean when I get to that part soon. And this part here is crucial because it is ultimately going to decide the final shape of your chair. So the more time you spend on fine-tuning the shape of your templates, the better your finished product is going to look because it is a carbon copy, quite literally. And here is where everything goes horribly wrong. In my haste to design a chair with better proportions, I forgot to actually measure how tall it was. And so I've succeeded in designing a chair for kids or other vertically challenged people. So back to the drawing board we go. And so that gave way to version 2.1, we'll call it, with a couple of extra little tweaks, as you can see here. And then, for whatever reason, I stopped.
One eternity later.
Well, welcome back to 2026, where my squirrel brain decided to pick this project up again, mainly because it was 20 degrees outside and I didn't feel like freezing in the front of the shop. I don't hate many things in life, but pine trees and cold weather are at the top of that list, and they change places depending on season. I'll let you guess why. And my other genius move is selling all of my walnut so that I had to go outside and dig through my junk pile to find something I could actually build a chair with. After a few minutes of tracing, it was time to go over to one of my favorite tools in the whole world, the bandsaw, to cut everything out in their rough shapes. The idea here is to get as close to the white line as you can without going over, kind of like that game Operation, or antagonizing your wife just to the point of her slapping you. Or so I've heard. Anyways, I like to leave about a 1/16 off the white line when I'm cutting on the bandsaw. Fun fact, this bandsaw is actually the first tool I bought new in my wood shop. Everything else had come from Marketplace or even drug out of a field, like in the case of my jointer. At this point, everything is generally in its final shape, with the pile of offcuts on the floor. Now, some of you are probably wondering, hey dude, why didn't you run all of your lumber through the planer before you traced all of your shapes on there so that it was already flat? Well, I don't know. I'm going to try and do it this way because generally the amount of shavings that I produce will fill up my 55-gallon dust collector in a matter of minutes. So by running less wood through, it should create less shavings, and all this stuff was pretty flat anyways. So we'll see if my harebrained idea pays off. So after everything got a pass over the jointer, it went to the only other tool that I purchased new, which is my Grizzly 20-inch planer, which I'll point out I was able to pay for from the proceeds of my garage sale where I sell my lumber once or twice a year. And that's kind of how I pitch it to my wife. Everything kind of pays for itself 99% of the time. Yeah, see what I did there? So everything ended up planing down to about 6/4 thickness, and overall it pretty good. There weren't really any flaws that were very obvious or easy to see at all. Don't look at that. The next day started with a panic because I, in 2026, had remembered in 2024 that I had built the template too short. What I did not remember, however, was that I'd fixed it. So I had to put it all back together and sit down with it just to make sure that I had not wasted all of that walnut. Fortunately, I had not. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that that probably would have been the end of my chair building days right there. Well, we didn't give up, luckily, and we are now at the point of the project that gives me both the heebies and the jeebies, as they say in my neck of the woods. The router table is just something that I will never get comfortable using, especially with this flush trim bit sticking up, which is basically just a big stick with two blades on it spinning at 10,000 RPM. But concerns of self-harm aside, there is also a whole lot of ways for this to go wrong and ruin your project. And yes, I'm foreshadowing. But hey, it all makes for good cinema, right? Anyways, my template and workpiece are held together by a sandwich of masking tape and super glue, and I'm setting the cut height of my flush cut bit just on the ragged edge of what's possible, as you can see there. You'll also see that there was a small gap between the workpiece and the template. And we're going to add that to the list of things that we don't do. Why? Because that means the template is not firmly stuck to the workpiece. And also, as you can see, it's been a while since I've used this tool, and so it's taking a minute for me to get reacclimated to how everything works and what the actual right way to feed the workpiece through the bit is. And after a few more sphincter clenching moments, the absolutely predictable thing happens where the template slides off the workpiece and the bit just completely eats into the leg. Awesome. So what I ended up figuring out is that over the last couple of years, the template had indeed warped just enough for it to not sit flat on the workpiece. So after a couple of trips over the jointer, I came back and retaped everything. And here you can see what the actual process is. And it's as simple as just putting masking tape on the joining faces. One side gets super glue, the other gets the accelerant, and they stick together pretty much instantly. But when everything goes right, it's actually really satisfying. Okay, enough of that. So now that all of my pieces match the templates, it is time to clean up the joining faces. And I don't run that over the router table just so I can get a nice clean and flat face. So what I'm doing here is marking it, and then I'll take it over to my table saw and use probably one of the most scientific pieces I have in the shop. Totally kidding, by the way. But in all seriousness, the edge of the plywood is zero clearance to the edge of the blade. So I line up my score marks with the edge of the plywood, and theoretically the blade should cut right along my score mark, thus making them very precise. This is actually a huge deal because it ultimately dictates how well your pieces fit together. You don't want to have to mess with any gaps, and if you take your time and do it right, everything theoretically should fall right into place. So by now, all of my parts and pieces are congruent, which means same size and same shape. Exactly the same shape. And if you're wondering, yes, I am indeed procrastinating doing anything about that because I don't have a plan yet. But anyways, this is the point in our story where theory and reality collide. In theory, everything should match up perfectly. In reality is reality, and it'll probably be just close enough to piss you off because it's not close enough to accept. All right? Yep. Come on, man. Oh, jeez. Really, though, I don't think it's the end of the world. Some slight adjustments on the table saw should get it all put together pretty tight. And that's exactly what I did. I spent a little bit of time marking and fitting and trimming incremental pieces off, and ultimately they all fit together on both sides very well. At this point, I'm happy enough with the fit that I can go ahead and proceed with gluing everything together. Well, I guess this is the point in the videos where it's time for assembly, and the fancy YouTube woodworker pulls out his domino machine and says, let's get to it. And everyone rolls their eyes and says, but we don't have a $2,000 domino machine. Well, guess what? I don't either. Today, we'll be using a doweling machine. I think pegging machine was already taken. I'm not really sure on that. Don't look it up. But anyways, this is a Triton doweler, and I have jokingly renamed it here. But it's going to do basically the same thing. It's not as fun. To start, I'm just using a straight edge to make some reference marks, which will show me where to line up the doweler on the workpieces. This doesn't need to be exact, but you also need to make sure that your dowel holes are not too close to the edge. I'm being very careful with the words I'm picking here. Where the leg meets the seat part here, I'm actually going to dowel it twice for some added strength, just in case. I'm just going to stop while I'm ahead. Anywho, so it's time to use the doweling machine. And the first thing you got to do is make sure that it is square and that the alignment bracket is tight, because it has moved on me before and I did almost throw it across the room. Easy money. The holes themselves are 5/16 and the dowels are just something you buy from the box stores, and they are surprisingly a pretty tight fit. And from here, everything, believe it or not, just kind of slid together without any real issue. And this goes for both sides. I managed to get them clamped together and dried in about an hour, which I'm really shocked about. Well, it was going too well. Here's the catch. When I was cutting out the templates, I used the flush trim bit around the edges, as you see here, but I did not mark off the mating faces where the two pieces of wood join together. So I put the template back on there, and I think that is really to blame for some of the misalignments here, we'll say. So the lesson here is make sure you mark off your cutting faces when you do all your flush trims so everything matches up exactly. Not that big of a deal. I was able to mark some lines on the bottom of the back feet and cut those flush, and it got everything pretty close to matching up. So now all there was to do was to take the spindle sander and kind of clean up the transitions and the curves, and then a little bit of sanding on the back sides here to get everything to work right before going to the round over. Speaking of hiccups, I fished this cutoff out of the trash and decided that was a close enough match to make this work. After a little bit of trimming, a little bit of sanding, it was ready to glue in. I figured since it came from a local spot that the color grain would probably match pretty close. Oh boy. Well, while the glue dried, I decided to fix my knot hole here, and I'm using a polyamide stick, which is basically a glue gun with a nylon stick in it. It works basically like a hot glue gun would. It heats up, you squirt the stuff in there, it cools down, and I use a chisel to clean it out, and then it sands down pretty easily. Pretty nice. And it beats the hell out of using epoxy. It chisels out really easily, even with my dull chisels. And then after that, you just sand it flat and voila, you're done. Now, by this point, my other repair was dry, so it was time to cut off the excess and sand that flat too and see how well it matches. Well, the answer is not even close because this is not a blacktail video. My bad. Moving along, it's time to make the base for the chair, and I've got a couple of scraps clamped in to set my height. At this point in the project, I am running dangerously low on material, so parts and pieces that I wouldn't give a second look to are, well, they're getting put into play here. So I've got a couple pieces of wide and flat material that I'm milling down to make into the seat base itself. I'm bringing those down to 3/4 of an inch thick. From there, we break out the old dado stack, and I'm going to use this to make tenons on the edges of the panel that will slide into the chair frames themselves. So the dado stack is going to be a 1/2 inch wide, and then the cut depth will be 1/8. I like to undersize my tenons because if my mortises look like a beaver chewed them out, you can usually hide it pretty well with your workpiece that way. And in my case, it's usually always when my mortises look like a beaver has chewed them out. So hopefully with my new tool I've got there in the background, we can get around that this time. So from there, I lay out my tenon widths and then go over to the bandsaw and cut them out real quick. And here's what we're left with. Nice, neat little tenons. I had to stop and say hi for a second. This is Pearl. She's the guard dog. Totally ferocious. So now that my tenons are cut, it is time to lay out the mortises. And so what I'm doing is putting masking tape down, lining everything up, and then I will use a knife to cut out the areas around the tenons so I know where to cut. This is the first time that I've done this, but it gave a pretty exact location of where everything needs to go with no guesswork, so I'll probably do this again. This is a mortise machine, and the simplest explanation I can offer is it drills a square hole. So we're going to use that to drill some square holes, fit some square pegs. You'll have to excuse my lack of enthusiasm. It was probably 5 o'clock in the morning at this point, so I wasn't fully awake yet. But this tool is pretty cool. It's got a little drill bit that spins inside the chisel there, and the downward force cleans up the sides of the holes. So when you turn the machine on, the drill bit starts spinning inside of the chisel, and then there's a lever on the side that you pull down on, and that's what actually gives you your downforce on the chisel. So in this case, I'm working really slowly because this is actually the first time I've used this machine on a workpiece, and it actually is pretty easy to use. I like it a lot, and it's a whole lot better than hand chiseling. So in this case, I'm going to drill down about 1/2 inch, maybe a little bit more, and make sure that I have enough room for my tenons to slide in. And yes, this is a 1/2 inch bit, and my tenons are 1/2 inch as well, so it should be a very tight friction fit. Being that this is the first time I've actually used this tool in a production sense, I was pretty happy with it. That first hole takes a little bit, but after that, it just slices like butter. It wasn't perfect. I had to go clean everything up a little bit with the chisel, but it was nothing super involved to get it all to fit correctly, and it just slid right in. So very happy with that. And that leads us to the only logical next step, and that is a test sit. But I wasn't done with the base yet. I wanted to add some blocking on each end to kind of contain the cushion once I install it. So I put the dado stack back in and cut a 1/4 inch deep spline in both the base and the blocks, as you see here. After rummaging through my vast library of junk offcuts, I found something that would work perfectly for a spline and cut it down to fit. Once I was sure I had the right piece, I squirted some glue in there and clamped it all together and moved on to the next part. Now for the seat back, I had to dig deep, real deep into the scrap pile to get a couple pieces worthy of making the back. And for the sake of brevity, it was the exact same process as the bottom with all the cuttings of mortise and tenons. A short time later, it was ready for assembly to see it in its full glory. At this point, it was time to add one final detail to this chair, and that is a roundover. And to do that, I'm using a 3/4 inch radius roundover bit on my router table. Fortunately, this bit is a lot less daunting than the flush trim bit, and I was able to motor through both sides of both halves of the chair pretty quickly. I will say that I did step the process, meaning I didn't have the full depth of the cut initially. I did it in 2 passes to get the full roundover effect on the chairs. And unfortunately, at this point, there was nothing left to do but sand, and that took hours. But fortunately, we have time lapse and editing to speed it to a couple seconds. And finally, it's time for assembly. So a little squirt of glue here, a little dab of glue there, a little bit of tab A into slot B, and voila, you got yourself a chair. Easy, right? Nothing to it? I thought so. Now I make jokes, but I think all told, when I get to the point of finishing this chair, I had about 45 hours total into the project. And there's a lot of learning curve there, and I think there's some efficiencies to be had by repeating this process a few times and getting good at it. But still, it was quite a lengthy project to get it to the finished point. Sometimes it's just a big old game of you can't win, because just when I thought I was done, that happened. That one hurt, and there was nothing I could do about it, unfortunately. The lesson learned there is if you have to put a bunch of stress on it with clamps, then something's not right, and you need to take it apart and fix whatever that is. And that's just a lesson you learn as you go. And I knew it, and I did it anyways. Fortunately, it broke right there at the joint where there's 4 dowels in it, and it didn't go all the way through, so I just put a little bit of sawdust and glue in there and covered it up and moved on about finishing with the project. Here I'm wiping it down with mineral spirits to get all the dust off in preparation for the finish, which is coming up next. All right, it's not perfect, but it's as close to perfect as I can manage with the skills I've got. And I've wiped it down with mineral spirits. So we're gonna let it dry for a little bit and then put the finish on. Very happy. Okay, so for a finish, we're gonna be using Rubio Monocoat, and it's a hard wax oil. You mix it 3 parts to 1 part, and you just wipe it right on. It's pretty foolproof, and it's really durable, and it's waterproof, and it's something that I really like to use because I can't screw it up. So let's go ahead and mix this up and start applying it. Well, fortunately, I was able to recruit a little bit of help in the finishing process, and we knocked it out pretty quickly. And I can't understate how easy it is. You mix it up, you wipe it on, and then you buff it back off, and that's the whole finishing process. Well, there you go. 45 hours worth of work into a 22-minute video. And statistically speaking, very few of you are still watching. But for those of you that are still with me, I cannot thank you enough for your attention. I'm trying really hard to edit better quality videos. And if I was able to hold your attention this long, then something's going right. I do still have to do upholstery for this. I'm going to do a leather cushion here and as well for the back. So I'll probably throw that into another video. If there's any interest, please let me know. Otherwise, I will see you on the next video. Thanks.